What if the season you're in right now isn't a loading screen? What if it isn't God pausing your life while He figures out what to do with you? We tend to picture waiting as empty space, a blank hallway between where we were and where we're going. But what if that hallway isn't empty at all? What if it's actually a workshop ... and you're the one being built? Today we're going to walk through 5 people in Scripture who each disappeared into a season of silence before their calling arrived, and we're going to uncover what God was actually doing while they thought nothing was happening at all. If you've ever felt stuck, forgotten, or tired of praying the same prayer with no answer, stay with me. This one might change how you see your delay. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, we go deep into Scripture to find the quiet truths that steady us in real life. Not just information, but formation. Today's question is simple. What is God actually doing in the waiting? We're going to look at 5 gap years in the Bible, seasons that don't get much airtime in a typical sermon, but that shaped some of the most important people in the story of Scripture. And from those 5 gaps, we'll draw up 5 invisible works God does in the silence before the promise ever arrives. Let's get into it. Moses in Midian. The stripping of self-reliance. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, trained, educated, powerful. At 40 years old, he saw injustice, and he tried to fix it his own way. He took a life, and he had to run. He didn't run into ministry. He ran into obscurity. 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness of Midian, married into a local family, quietly herding flocks in a land that wasn't his own. 40 years, not 40 days. 40 years of nothing that looked like destiny. But here's what was happening underneath the surface. The same wilderness Moses would one day lead a nation through, he was first learning to survive in alone, unnoticed, unhurried. The confidence of the palace was being replaced by something slower and steadier, dependence, the first invisible work. God strips away self-reliance before He hands you responsibility. Moses had to stop being someone who fixed things with his own strength before he could become someone who led through God's strength. The burning bush didn't create Moses' calling. It revealed a man who had finally been emptied enough to say, "Who am I that I should go?" Sometimes the waiting season isn't punishment for what you did wrong. It's preparation for a weight you're not yet strong enough in the right way to carry. Hannah in the temple. The deepening of dependence. Hannah wanted one thing, a child. Year after year, she went to the temple and she wept. She was provoked by a rival, misunderstood by a priest who thought she was drunk on wine when she was simply pouring out her soul. Nothing about her waiting was quiet or peaceful. It was raw, it was humiliating, it was years long. But notice what her waiting produced. By the time Samuel was born, Hannah wasn't just grateful, she was surrendered. She gave her son back to the Lord's service almost immediately. That kind of open-handed devotion doesn't happen overnight. It's forged in years of crying out with nothing to hold onto but God Himself. The second invisible work. Waiting deepens dependence until prayer stops being a request and becomes a relationship. Hannah's delay didn't just produce a son. It produced a woman who could release what she'd longed for the most because she'd already learned to hold everything open-handed before God. Paul in Arabia. The unlearning before the sending. After his encounter on the road to Damascus, Paul didn't immediately begin his ministry tour. Scripture tells us he went away into Arabia for a period, largely undocumented, before eventually returning to Damascus, and, years later, being sent out from Antioch. Think about that. The most theologically trained man of his generation, a Pharisee among Pharisees, still needed a season of unlearning before he could carry the gospel he used to persecute. We don't get a highlight reel of what happened in Arabia. We get silence. And that silence is the point. The third invisible work. God uses hidden seasons to unlearn what qualified you for your old life so you can be requalified for the new one. Paul's brilliance wasn't the problem. His framework was. He had to relearn everything he thought he knew about the law, the Messiah, and grace, away from an audience, away from applause, away from pressure to perform. Some lessons can only be learned when no one is watching, and nothing is required of you but to sit with God. David in the wilderness. The training of integrity under pressure. David was anointed king as a boy. Then he spent years, some scholars estimate close to a decade, running from Saul, hiding in caves, surviving in the wilderness, as a fugitive with a target on his back. Twice, David had the opportunity to kill Saul and take the throne early. Twice, he refused. This is the part we skip past too quickly. David wasn't just waiting to become king. He was becoming the kind of king who wouldn't seize power dishonestly. If he had taken the throne early, by force, he would have started his reign the same way he refused to end Saul's, through violence and self-promotion. The fourth invisible work. The wilderness trains your integrity while no one else is watching. The character David displayed on the throne wasn't formed on the throne. It was formed in the cave, when he had the power to take a shortcut and chose to wait for God's timing instead. Delay for David wasn't wasted time, it was the training ground for restraint. Joseph in prison, the rewriting of the story. Joseph's dream was clear. His family would one day bow to him. But before that dream came true, he was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and forgotten in an Egyptian prison for years. Notice the layers of injustice. It wasn't one bad season, it was betrayal stacked on betrayal. And through all of it, Joseph kept serving faithfully wherever he was placed, even when it seemed pointless. By the time Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he wasn't the same young man who'd once bragged about his dreams to his brothers. He'd become someone who could say, later to the very brothers who betrayed him, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." The fifth invisible work. Waiting rewrites your story from one of bitterness to one of purpose. Joseph's years of silence didn't just position him for power. They positioned his heart to handle power without revenge. Without that prison, Pharaoh might have gotten a competent administrator, but Egypt, and Joseph's own family, needed a forgiven man who could forgive. 5 different people, 5 different circumstances, but the same hidden pattern underneath. Moses, stripped of self-reliance. Hannah, deepened independence. Paul, unlearned before being sent. David, trained in integrity under pressure. Joseph, rewritten from bitterness to purpose. None of them could see, in the middle of it, what the waiting was doing. From the inside, it just felt like delay. It felt like being forgotten. It felt like silence with no explanation. But from where we stand now, with the whole story in front of us, we can see it clearly. The waiting wasn't the absence of God's work. It was God's work, just work that happens beneath the surface, where you can't measure it, where no one applauds it, and where the only evidence it's happening is your own quiet faithfulness. So, if you're in a season like this right now, if your prayer feels unanswered, if your calling feels delayed, if you feel forgotten in your own version of Midian, or the temple, or Arabia, or the wilderness, or the prison, consider this. You are not stuck. You are not forgotten. You may be under construction. The question worth asking isn't when will this end? It's what is being formed in me while I wait. Stay faithful in the quiet. The gap years are never wasted. They're just invisible until they're not. If this spoke to you, take 30 seconds to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing deep, honest biblical study to people who need it in their own waiting season. Drop a comment. Which of these 5, Moses, Hannah, Paul, David, or Joseph, feels closest to where you are right now? And if you know someone in a season of waiting, send them this video. Sometimes the most encouraging thing you can say is simply, "You're not stuck, you're being built." Until next time, stay faithful in the quiet.